Madam President.
Democratic Whip.
Madam President, it was about 12 years ago that I went into a hearing of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I think it was about the time that Arlen Specter was the chairman of the committee, and he had a hearing on something that I knew nothing about. It was called interchange fees. I walked in there and the room was packed, and it turned out there were two sides to a debate over this so-called interchange fee. On one side were the monsters and giants of credit card industry, Visa and MasterCard, the duopoly that controls 75% of the credit card transactions in the United States. And on the other side were a handful of people from gas stations and restaurants. And what were they talking about with the interchange fee? They were talking about the fact that credit cards issued by banks that honor Visa and MasterCard exchanges are required to pay fees on every transaction. Well, what was interesting about the conversation was that when it got down to it, the retailer, the restaurant owner, the gas station, had no control over what the fee was going to be charged by the bank and Visa and MasterCard. Take it or leave it. You want to honor our credit cards and use them in your business, you'll pay the interchange fee. I kind of thought that was unusual and maybe unfair. There was no competition, there was no voice, the retailer just had to pass along the charge, and Visa and MasterCard raised the charges on a regular basis. They just did recently. We're fighting inflation in America, and Visa and MasterCard are on the other side of the battle. Consumers and retailers are trying to keep prices down. Visa and MasterCard are trying to run them up with a fee they charge for each transaction. And so I decided to ask for a study. That's pretty easy, innocent. Study to find out how much the fees were, why these credit card giants were charging fees in the United States, which they weren't charging in other countries. Well, they fought me tooth and nail to stop from this study. So I got my back up and decided to offer an amendment to the Dodd-Frank bill, which dealt with Wall Street and the excesses of the 2008 recession. Came to the floor, offered it, and to everyone's surprise, it passed. And it regulated the amount of interchange fees on debit cards. Debit cards are just like a checking account. It didn't touch credit cards. So it turned out that that was a big deal because the big banks on Wall Street that were affected by my amendment were losing up to $8 billion a year in interchange fees that people were paying. And so debit cards were at least containing the growth of these fees while credit cards were still untouched. And so here we are today. American consumers are concerned about inflation and the high price of groceries and gas. What they may not know is that the fees charged on the credit cards that they use, known as swipe fees or interchange fees, are adding to the problem. Visa and MasterCard control just about 80% of the credit card market. Each time a credit card is used, whether for groceries, gasoline, critical drugs, anything else, Visa and MasterCard charge an interchange fee. Some of them that they keep for themselves, most of it is given to the bank that issued the card. It's usually charged as a percentage of the transaction plus a flat fee. For example, 2% of the transaction plus 10 cents each transaction. Visa and MasterCard set the fees on behalf of thousands of banks and tell the merchants, the retailers, the restaurants, take it or leave it. Merchants have no choice but to accept these outrageous fees if they want to have credit cards used by their customers. There's no negotiation, there's no competition. Small business owners and consumers take it or leave it or holding the bag. In 2022 alone, U.S. merchants and consumers paid $93.2 billion in these fees, credit card interchange fees, to line the pockets of the biggest banks on Wall Street. If you ask the man who owns the restaurant, or ask the lady who owns the shop, what percentage of your overhead cost is interchange fees on credit cards? You'll be shocked. Interchange fees are the second largest cost for small businesses, only behind labor cost. So think of that for a moment. Making your payroll is the highest expense. The next expense is not utilities or rent, it's the interchange fees charged by Visa and MasterCard and their banks. Despite the nearly $100 billion Visa and MasterCard took out of communities and small businesses across the country last year, guess what they're going to do in October? They're going to raise the interchange fee again. While we're trying to fight inflation, every angle that we can find to bring down the cost of groceries and gas, the credit card companies have decided it's just the right time to have this take it or leave it fee increased. When credit card fees go up, it increases inflation, consumers pay it. I strongly urge Visa and MasterCard to reconsider this misguided decision. Wrote them a letter, doubt if they'll read it. I'm not holding my breath. That's why I've made it a priority to pass the Bipartisan Credit Card Competition Act this year. The Credit Card Competition Act, which I introduced with Senator Marshall, there he is on the floor now. Good to see you, Senator. Senator Welch, who has joined us from Vermont, and Senator Vance of Indiana. A bipartisan bill would finally introduce competition and choice to the credit card market and bring down the excessive credit card fees. It would require only the largest 30 banks in America, and they're the big boys, banks with more than $100 billion in assets, to enable at least 2 credit card networks to be used on credit cards, with at least one of the networks a company outside the Visa and MasterCard duopoly. So there'd be some competition. I thought that was part of a free market, but when it comes to credit cards, they want no competition. Merchants would then get to choose one of the networks. There'd be real competition for their business, and it would keep the fees as low as possible. The Credit Card Competition Act is estimated to save merchants and consumers $15 billion a year. With that in mind, nobody should be surprised to hear that Visa and MasterCard and their big bank buddies have committed to, quote, spend whatever is needed to stop the Durbin Marshall Amendment. I stood up to the big banks and giant credit card company, debit card companies in 2010 when I introduced similar reforms, and I'll always choose Main Street over Wall Street. It is long overdue for Congress to break up the sweetheart deal that Visa, MasterCard, and the biggest banks in America and certain airlines enjoy. We must bring the Bipartisan Credit Card Competition Act to the floor for a vote. Madam President, the question is whether my colleagues will listen to the consumers and families that are struggling with inflation, whether they'll listen to the restaurants that they frequent, as I do, whether they'll listen to the small shops and businesses that have to pay these outrageous fees. Give them a chance. Bring competition into the duopoly. Tell Visa and MasterCard they cannot lord over these people who are working hard for a living and shouldn't be stuck with these duopoly fees. I yield the floor.